Despite being the console that would end up saving the gaming industry in North America, the NES paradoxically had some of the all-time hardest games. The phrase Nintendo Hard has come to define an entire generation of titles that, taking influence from their arcade counterparts, forced players to complete entire grueling challenges in a single sitting, or required some serious pattern recognition and reflexes to even have a hope of making it to the credits screen. The hardest NES games have a legitimate claim to being some of the hardest games ever made, and the following 20 titles are arguably the most difficult in the console's almost 700-game library. Of course, just because a game is difficult doesn't mean it isn't fun, with some of the most challenging games on the NES also ranking as some of the console's best titles. So, with that out of the way, here are our picks for the hardest games on the NES. Compared to some of the other developers with multiple games on the NES, Sunsoft's titles tend to be slightly more forgiving, but one of the studio's best games, Blaster Master, is also one of its most challenging. The real challenge of Blaster Master largely comes through the game's tricky platforming sequences and hard-to-find health recharges, making some stretches of the game's main story a true endurance gauntlet to see if you can make it from one location to the next. Plus, Blaster Master features not one, but two difficult gameplay modes, with the overhead on-foot sections just as challenging as the side-scrolling vehicle ones. Like a lot of other arcade titles that would make their way to the NES, Ikari Warriors does little to take away from the quarter-eating challenge of its coin-op counterpart. This top-down run-and-gun is essentially SNK's take on Capcom's Commando, but it's perhaps even harder than that classic arcade game thanks to some tricky enemy waves and a laughably low stock of player lives. Lots of players rightfully list Contra as one of the more difficult NES games, but at least Contra had the Konami code to get 30 lives. With Ikari Warriors, you've got no such luck. It might be surprising to see a puzzle title on the list of hardest NES games, but anyone who's played Solomon's Key knows just how dastardly some of its 64 levels are. To add insult to injury, one hit in Solomon's Key is all it takes to die and have to restart a level, requiring perfect execution of each stage in a single go. Considering how much trial and error are necessary to even learn the levels, it must have taken players an absurdly long time to actually clear this game back in its heyday. Still, Solomon's Key is one of the best and most unique puzzle games in the NES library, even with its intimidating challenge. Those of us who grew up with the NES as our first gaming console were also of the age where, despite not actually being old enough to watch the Friday the 13th films, knew Jason Voorhees as the definitive horror icon of the 1980s. So when LJN released a Friday the 13th game for the NES, that was our first chance to get to play something that had the promise of being as scary as the films we were so desperate to see, right? Wrong. Friday the 13th is scary, but not for the reasons you might imagine. The game is needlessly difficult while also featuring the absolute barest bones of gameplay, requiring a frustrating amount of trial and error to even encounter Jason, much less survive those often insta-kill scenarios. All three of the NES Ninja Gaiden titles lay claim to being some of the hardest games on the console, hence why we'll talk about the other two in a little bit. But the third game is at least slightly less challenging than the other two. That said, Ninja Gaiden 3 is still unmercifully difficult, proving that even the least challenging Ninja Gaiden game is more challenging than most NES titles on a good day. Ironically enough, it's not necessarily the boss encounters of Ninja Gaiden 3 that are hard, as much as it's the game's uncharacteristically long stages and their countless platforming and combat challenges that Ryu has to cross before even getting to the level's big bad. One of the more famously difficult games on the NES, the Immortal is almost a cruel joke that the developer seems to be pulling on the player. A single wrong move in the Immortal can result in a game over screen, and the number of insta-death traps and encounters that players can come across in the Immortal is almost laughable. Even other famously challenging dungeon-crawling RPGs like Shadowgate pale in comparison to the Immortal, solidifying the game's place as one of the most sadistically brutal titles on the NES. Believe it or not, when it comes to NES-era scrolling shooters, Gradius is actually one of the more manageable titles, with some practice. But that surmountable challenge does little to take away from the fact that Konami's classic shmup is still one of the NES's hardest games, with a steep, upfront challenge meant to separate the wheat from the chaff and quickly acclimate players to what the rest of the game will require. Gradius is classic for a reason, and its NES port is surprisingly one of the best versions of the game, even if it's also one of the most difficult titles in the console's library. Some gaming genres are more challenging for some while being easier for others, meaning that the concept of difficult games can be subjective. But one title that seems to almost universally be recognized as one of the hardest games on the NES is Punch-Out! The difficulty of Punch-Out! Comes from its deceptively simple control scheme and gameplay loop, which merely asks you to decipher each fighter's attack patterns before responding in kind. But the kicker for Punch-Out! Is that one false move or mistimed punch is all it takes to get pummeled into submission and meet the game over screen, presenting players with a razor-thin margin for error that requires mechanical precision and knowledge of each fighter's quirks. The importance of Final Fantasy in helping to popularize the JRPG can't be overstated, but there's no denying that the first game in the series is a little tedious in comparison to later entries. While not a traditionally difficult game in terms of requiring reflexes or pattern recognition, Final Fantasy is overly reliant on grinding encounters, which results in the game's encounter rate being sadistic in certain dungeons. Throw in the fact that players have limited restorative items and magic and can't effectively heal when inside a dungeon, and you have an incredibly challenging JRPG that holds players' feet to the fire unless they overlevel their party. Merely mentioning Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in a conversation about difficult NES games is bound to give an entire generation of players PTSD from the game's dam level, and that's just one of the earliest challenges the game throws at you. Thankfully, later Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles games would adjust their challenge in a way befitting the source material, but that initial NES game is one of the hardest action platformers of the era, both in terms of its regular stages and its obnoxiously difficult boss battles. Konami's Castlevania is one of the foundational action platformers on the NES, and one of the greatest games in the genre. It's also unwieldy, needlessly slow, and filled with opportunities for enemies to knock Simon Belmont into a pit, resulting in instant death. More than the actual action half of Castlevania's gameplay, the real challenge comes in the title's platforming, with the slow, plodding movements of Simon and his limited jump range making even seemingly easy platforming sections a grueling challenge. And don't even get me started on the boss fight against Death without using its iconic cheese. Similar to Blaster Master, the difficulty of the adventures of Bayou Billy largely comes through thanks to its multiple game modes that the title throws at you. The standard, side-scrolling beat-em-up stages are somewhat tough to begin with enemies taking a real beating before they go down and Bayou Billy having limited health pickups to rely on. But when things switch up to the riverboat or jeep sections, it only gets tougher, and you've got to survive these change-ups with zero preparation for their gameplay differences, otherwise it's back to the beginning. A game based on the Addams Family is not exactly what you might expect for one of the NES's hardest titles, but Fester's Quest isn't just any ordinary game. This top-down, action-adventure, run-and-gun hybrid lets players take on the role of Uncle Fester as he tries to stop an alien invasion, and the controls are tuned in such a way that lining up shots and dodging incoming projectiles is way more difficult than it needs to be. Throw in the fact that it's often hard just to know where to go or what to do, and you have one of the most notoriously difficult games on the console. Sitting squarely in the middle between the challenge of the easiest and hardest games in the trilogy is the original Ninja Gaiden. Don't get me wrong, Ninja Gaiden is still an absurdly difficult game with some of the most intense platforming and combat of any 8-bit title, but the layouts of the game's stages and patterns of its different bosses are more telegraphed and easier to memorize, meaning all it takes is a little persistence and a lot of practice to eventually see Ryu Hayabusa through to the end of his journey. Compared to the other 5 Mega Man games on the NES, the first title in the series is substantially more challenging, strictly for the diabolical design of its 6 stages. But even once you get past the 6 Robot Masters, you still have to clear the ultimate gauntlet of Dr. Wily's Fortress, and the iteration of that final gauntlet in the first Mega Man is perhaps the hardest in the entire series. Sure, there's a password function, and you can always come back for another attempt when you're ready, unlike a lot of the other games on this list. But having to clear the game's hardest challenge in a single go with no breaks makes the first Mega Man one of the most challenging games in the NES library. The licensed Silver Surfer game is arguably the hardest shmup in the NES library, but not for the reasons you might expect. While some of the title's difficulty can be attributed to legitimately challenging level design and enemy patterns, an even larger part of it comes from the game's wonky controls and hard-to-see projectiles. Shooting games are, by their nature, difficult experiences that push players to become better in a very short amount of time, but Silver Surfer is almost laughably hard, and it's also brutally unfair that much of its challenge comes from how difficult it is to maneuver the surfer around the screen. Both Castlevania and Castlevania 2 are challenging games, albeit for different reasons, but neither of them stacks up to the degree of difficulty that Castlevania 3 presents. Between its branching pathways, multiple playable characters, and higher balance of combat and platforming, you might expect that Castlevania 3 would be easier than the other games in the trilogy, but the design of its stages and the devious bosses that players have to overcome throw any semblance of a more accessible experience out the window. But thanks to Simon's knockback being especially pronounced in Castlevania 3, the worst offender of all is gravity. Like Ikari Warriors, Ghosts and Goblins was an already challenging arcade cabinet that became even more difficult in its NES port. Ghosts and Goblins might legitimately be the hardest Capcom game in the studio's catalog, and that's saying something. It's one of the few games that could genuinely be described as sadistic, giving no leeway to the player and requiring an almost unmanageable amount of coordination, precision, and pattern recognition to even make it to the end of the first stage. Just play Super Ghouls and Ghosts instead. Ask any fan of the NES Ninja Gaiden trilogy which entry in the series is the hardest, and they're all likely to provide a different answer. For my money though, that honor has to go to Ninja Gaiden 2. While Ninja Gaiden 2 is largely the same as its predecessor in terms of the core gameplay loop, there are some new wrinkles thrown in both the regular stages and the boss battles that make some of its challenge the apex of a series that's known for it. Especially in the ridiculously hard second stage, where Ryu has to use wind currents to cross seemingly impossible platforming challenges, only to be faced with one of the game's hardest bosses as a reward. Like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles before it, even the mere mention of Battletoads is sure to conjure up anxiety for its most notorious challenge, the hoverbike stage. On the whole, Battletoads isn't all that difficult when we're just talking about the regular beat-em-up sections. Instead, it's the ridiculously challenging in-between parts like rappelling down a tree trunk or riding a hoverbike at top speed and having zero margin for error that saw players wipe out and never return to what's otherwise a fantastic game. For just the hoverbike stage alone, Battletoads has a strong claim to being the absolute hardest game on the NES. Those are our picks for the hardest games on the NES, but everyone has their own titles that caused them no shortage of grief back in the day. Let us know which games are forever the poster children for Nintendo Hard in your mind down in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the notification bell for more content from Cheat Code Central.